So, so I'm going to talk about what's new in Tilos 10.1. So I'm assuming that you've got a reasonable grasp on what's how to use Tilos 9. And my name is Richard Ormrod. I'm the technical expert in Tilos in the UK. So if you've got any questions, you can always reach out to me in the future. So I think we need to spend a little moment on the migration from Tilos 9 to 10.1. So first of all, I would recommend that you install Tilos 10.1 in parallel on the same machine as Tilos 9. So it can live on the same machine and it shares the same license. But when I sent you the license information, that needs to be updated. So you get a slightly changed product ID, but the serial number remains the same. So when you first start Tilos 10.1, it asks you to update the license. And what you're updating is the same place that it is already. So you're not installing a second license, you're updating the one that you've already got. And so from that point onwards, 10.1 and 9 will work from the same license on the same machine. Okay, so that's the good news. I guess to some extent the bad news is that when you open a project in Tilos 10.1 from an older version, it will convert it and there's no saving back. So once you've made that forward step, then you can't save back to an earlier version. So, and I want to just walk through that process for you so that you can understand it, because my strong recommendation is that you make a copy of the file before saving it. You make a copy of the file before opening it, I beg your pardon. So, because whilst this is Tilos 10.1, there have been a Tilos 9.1 and a Tilos 10.0, all of which that had some useful features but quite small, and 10.1 was always going to be a bug fix that was going to be much more stable than 10.0. So I waited for that. So when we open a file, so I'm going to find, and I'll come back to this dialog because this is a new dialog presently, which will come back to that. So I'm going to find a Tilos 9.0 file, and I'm going to click on open. So this is the experience that you will have. My strong recommendation is that I've already saved that file, so I've got a copy. Now, unfortunately, I've opened that one previously. So that wasn't very impressive as I didn't test that. So I've already opened. So at this point here, you get this conversion process. So if you accept this, that's fine, but it then wants you to make a backup before you do anything else. And this is going to create a .old file, but it's going to be in the format that you say now. So if I say yes, it will make a .old file in a 9.0 format, but I'm going to get this recurring dialogue as it moves through the various versions from 9.0 to 10.1. So there are some issues there that I would urge you to be a bit more diligent by and save it before you take that conversion step. So that's something that you got to just get used to at the very beginning. But I think it is definitely worth a change. Any issues that don't work will only be fixed in 10.1 going forward. Some projects are closing, like Crossrail, would probably stay with what you've already got, but everything else, HS2, Network Rail, are going to move forward into the 10.1 format in due course. So make a copy before converting. Okay, so now we're going to get involved in the detailed user interface improvements. So I've broken this into several steps. And so the first one is, which we've already had a glimpse of, is when you start Tilos, you're presented with a file selector where you can open recent projects, make new ones, and search for a project that you can get to. And when you close a file, it does not close Tilos. So when you open Tilos, this is what you're presented with: a list of your recent projects, a list of your templates in the default location, and if you want to open another one, you can go here as I did before. So this is really useful, because if I open a project, like the one that we're going to use for this presentation, it opens it in Tilos, and if I close this file, then it doesn't close Tilos. Well, it sort of does, but you're then presented with the same positions. If you want to exit Tilos, then you would use the exit button and not the close button. Okay, so that's, I think, a very useful practical step that has been undertaken. So that's the first point. Then I think another major change, and a welcome one, is that the print and the preview have been merged into what's called a non-modal dialog. So you can still launch the print from the toolbar, but the print preview has disappeared, and print has also finally emerged onto the file menu. So if we take print, then it puts the whole screen into a sort of print and preview mode. And you've got the combination of the dialog that you had previously for printing and the layout of the page breaks with the blue dotted lines. So you can't turn the blue dotted lines off at this point. You can choose a different page size for whatever printer you've got accessible to you, and you can set the page size, so you can manually make that adjustment. So you've got 100% scale that you've got manually. You'll know that's going to fit without any scaling, because it's a 100% size. If we had it as it was before, which is a bit too big, then without changing it on screen, we can print to one page, for example, which is reducing it to 88% of the original. So you've got all of those facilities, and I think it's definitely more user friendly. Now you have to go to the bottom to actually print. There's a print button, and if you want to pop out of this mode, you've got to click on the close button. So we're back on screen as we were previously. So that's a good step to make that I think everybody will appreciate. There are also two very useful scaling buttons on the screen to affect the screen resolution, screen scale. So there's this button here which affects the width of the screen, so it will fit the diagram to the width of the screen, and this one will fit the diagram to the height of the screen. So you can very easily get an overview of that. So I'm going to leave the width to be set, but the depth to be manually set by me. So that's a very useful improvement. Another useful improvement is that the task list can be seen next to the time distance view and replaces the Explorer. So if we go back to Tilos, the Explorer on the left hand side at the bottom now has got a couple of little dialogues, a couple of little buttons, and if I've got the main time distance cell selected and I take the task list button, then you've got the same task list that you have if you replace the diagram on screen, and it's fully functional, and you can right mouse click and choose which columns are there. You can search in here, but when you click on an item, that item is selected on the body of the time distance diagram. Of course, the tabs at the foot of the screen are exactly the same. You can edit it in this dialog as well as editing it at the foot of the on the tabs, or at the tool status line at the top of the screen. So I think a useful companion to the time distance diagram, and a good way of seeing some more information. So also following that thing, you can now, I think, perhaps create a link more easily. So again, if you were linked to something you can't see, you can right mouse click on a task, and previously you couldn't do this, but now you can create a predecessor or you can create a successor directly from here, and it launches the link dialog, so you see all of the settings for that, and you're asked here to select a new predecessor, for example. So previously you had to create a draw link by using the link icon, or with the task selected, you had to go to Links and Constraints tab and add a new predecessor or a new successor. So that's, I think, definitely a more direct way of doing that. So they've also introduced a drag and drop of a graphic file from either internally within Tilos or from the Windows Explorer outside of Tilos. So you can pop that in a graphic cell or a distance cell. So at the top here, I've got my map. In my library under graphic libraries, I've got some graphics that I'm using for milestones and logos and maps, etc. So if I took my road schematic here and I dragged it from my library and I dropped it here. Now, with the point I drop it is where the rubber box is going to be located. So I'd go in the top left-hand corner, and at this point is where I would then be able to scale it out. So it's slightly more direct way of doing it if you know exactly what you're doing. So that is a small useful improvement. Library items, additional library items can also now be organized hierarchically. So they couldn't previously. So task groups, accounts, that's financial values, lines, patterns, symbols, and graphics. So I'll show you one that I've got prepared in vector lines. So I've got a lot of lines in my list here. So if I double click on vector lines, so the diagram's replaced by that, I've got a section already called plain lines. So I've added a few to that. And so I want to reorganize what I've already got. And if you want to do that, then you've got to drag from the Explorer into the list on the right hand side. So let's make another one, we'll take one at this level and make a new I'm going to undo that. So I'm going to make a new one that I'm going to called dotted lines, for example. And with that line selected, I'm going to click on this symbol to make a sub-level entry. So I've got to do that first of all, and then I could find a dotted line here, for example, and then I could drag it from this area and drop it in this area here. But it's the only way I've found that you can do that. So you can organize your lines into some sensible groups where you've got a lot of them, and that's a good example, or with patterns, or with graphics, or with symbols. So if you've got a lot of library items, that's a good way of getting to grips with it. And when a view has a filter, you can see that on screen. So if I select my time distance cell on the display tab, this is where my filters are located. So I've made a filter, which you do by just clicking on the filter button, edit filter button there, but I've made one that's going to extract only those activities in zone 1. And when I do that, you can see there's an icon in the top left-hand corner up here. So that's a visual clue that you've got a filter running on this view in case you weren't sure of that. And you can right mouse click here and you can go back to this place and say no filter, or you could go to the diagram here and say no filter. So a good way of accessing that. And also we can set a time distance view as a default. We can launch activities from task lists or Gantt charts and see them in that time distance view. So if we go to our views section under time distance or integrated view, and I've taken this item and I've edited the view, and I can nominate only one view, time distance view, to be the default for task presentation. So if that's the case, and then I'm in some other view, such as a list view, and I select a number of activities by clicking once and then shift clicking again, and then with a number of tasks selected, if I right mouse click, I can now say show that selection in a time distance view. So it will launch that subset of tasks in the time distance view if you find that a useful editing environment to see tasks in at the moment. So that's again a useful feature to think about that. Now the help system has been improved radically, which is good news because obviously now an American company is behind it, not just a German company. So so it is definitely well worth delving into here if you've got any issues. So, and there's also a very good what's new in 10.1, what's new in 10.0, slightly more detail than the one that I put out. So if we look here, for example, just under this section here, there's quite a few little videos which are also useful. So apart from just seeing the text, you can also click on this, and without an internet connection, you're going to get a little view of how to do that particular thing. It just goes on repeat. So again, a useful thing, and much, much better than in the past. So so they're all of the user interface, small user interface things, large or small, but fundamentally, the objective has been to keep the behavior and the look and feel the same as it was in 9.0 and previously, because people are used to that. So it's about refinement, not revolution. So let's move on to some other topics. There's some improvements in the time distance diagram itself. That for those of you who might use a structure, some summary bar. So I've got another view in here, in fact, which is looking at some summary activities, and we'll look at this a bit more. But here we've got a single item, and if I click on the plus sign, it expands it out to show the children within that. And so I've made a summary activity and designated children. So if now I create a new task in this chart, I can choose a task template as always, but now I can choose which summary should I place this new activity in when I create it directly on the diagram. So that's an improvement if you are in that mode of operation. And you can also copy the a cell's display attributes and then update another view with that. So if I go to this back to our diagram, if I look at select the main time distance view and look at the display tab, so all of these options, links being ticked, we want to display progress. I'm using this particular calendar, I'm folding out these particular things. So all of those settings we could use somewhere else. So if we had another, and I think I might have set up that one. So if we go to this one, it's got a different view, it's got nothing ticked, it's got a different holiday calendar. Then if I go back to my original one and I right mouse click here, I can now copy the display settings from this cell to another view. So if I choose the one that said this one and say copy, it just wants to confirm that. And so we've taken what we had originally in the when it's copied it from, and it's updated this one at this particular point. So that's a useful thing if you've got several views set up and you want to quickly copy the settings. So we can also color code levels in the task hierarchy in the time distance cell. So again, that's for those people who use summaries, and I think so in tools options under display, you can now set a color set which you can create in the library, and you can give different colors to different levels. So that needs to be set up in advance, but then on the time distance diagram, we can look at some of the we can expand out those items, and the colored surround of each of these is driven from that library. So you can have different color codes for those different aspects. So and on the summary task icon here, you can choose to display, so we can close everything up, or we can see only the details, or we can choose to see a summary of one or another. And if you have a summary, you can select it and you can collapse it. It's not quite the same as a work breakdown structure. It's more of the sort of structure of organizing into a work breakdown structure that you find in Microsoft Project, and is also in Power Project, as well as the WBS structure that you can create and manage in Tilos and in P6 and in Power Project. So quite a lot of usefulness in that section for those people who do summary activities, of which is very popular on the continent. So there's a new method for quantity linear splitting. So if we have an activity, and we probably need to look at the progress settings for this, if we have an activity, if I select that activity, then on the progress tab, for those people who do progress, there's a new progress method, quantity simple, and at the moment there's 15,000 units, and I can say, well, at this particular point we've done 5,000 units. And so it will say, well, you must have done a third of this activity. So, and it marks up on the activity a third. And previously you could say 5,000, but you'd also have to say over what period that had been done. So just another slightly different method for those people doing sophisticated progressing. Okay, so now that's all the stuff on time distance. We can talk about list behavior, so we can quickly rattle through this if we look at a list. So the first column now is a sort of spreadsheet column that we can just, that is constant, even if we, so you've just got the same thing that you would have in Excel. So on the list that we can see on the time distance, next to the time distance cell, we can, if we've got a hierarchy, we can show it as a flat list, or we can expand it, etc. So perhaps if we saw the one with summaries, that might make a bit more sense. So is there as a flat list, or we can collapse it, or we can expand it. So some behavior there. There's also the ability to find in any list, actually, if we were looking for drainage, we can right mouse click in this list, and this bit is new, incremental search, but actually the shortcut Control I always works. So now if I start typing, if I'm looking for anything beginning with sorry, if I right mouse click incremental search DRA, so it's looking for everything beginning with DRA, and if I use the up and down arrows, it will just cycle through the list for anything that matches that criteria. So that's quite useful in a lot of places. So so that's it's been there already, but it's more easy to get at. If we copy and paste tasks in the task list, then it keeps the order that we would expect. So if we were taking, for example, and I've got a couple of projects, so I'm going to search it, I'm going to sort it on the sub-project item. So if I took these three activities, for example, and I copied them, and if I then select a row and I paste them, it will paste them in that particular place. At least that's what I was expecting. So so we'll copy that and we'll paste it in there. So that doesn't seem, that definitely worked for me yesterday. So I believe that does work. So we're going to talk a little bit about data exchange improvements. So where people have got the Microsoft Project Exchange module, now on the import or export section, this would become enabled. So it allows us to write directly to an XML format that is defined by Microsoft Project, and you can choose what to export, and you can choose where the differences from Tilos will go. So where's the start distance going to be stored in this field? Where's the end distance template name? Maybe we want the task ID number, not the internal ID number. Etc. So you define this, and that will define. When I click on finish, it will create that file. You can open it in Microsoft Project, so you can do that. You can import it as well. So you can import it and export it. But to get it on the time distance diagram, you need the start and end distance. I need a template reference as a minimum. So that's a new feature, mainly for our American users. And also now you can export to the clipboard quite a lot of information in the library. So if we were to take our task templates, would be a good example, and we wanted to, for example, make a activity code library in P6, for example. So if I double click here, so I've got this table on screen. Now there's a button in the top right hand corner called Export to Clipboard. You can choose through setup here what data fields you want to display, and then if you say Export to Clipboard, you can choose which ones it will send or not, and now that's on the clipboard. So if I were to open Excel, which I've opened on my other screen over here, and we paste, then that information has come from Tilos. On certain items you can send back. There's no import from clipboard at this point, but on those items you could always import from, then you've also got an import from clipboard. So I think that was the next point on the on my list. So you can also import those directly without going through the import route. But so that's the situation in terms of lists. I want to now talk about a couple of subtle yet very powerful features that have happened in the reschedule. So I've made a little very simple example so we can all easily understand that, I'm hoping. So I've just got two simple tasks here, which is a good representation of this is a cut and fill process in a civil engineering project where I've got to dig 400 400 cubic meters of material, and it's going to take me 8 hours to do that. So if I'm going to move it somewhere to fill it, then I want the fill to follow the duration of this activity here. So if I create, so let's go back to our PowerPoint. So we've got all this covered. So when we link two tasks, we can now set the successor to inherit the predecessor's quantity value. So if I select an activity on the calculation tab, the quantity field here, you can type in, or depending on what you're modeling it on, it could take the length of the activity. So this activity here, I've got to fill the same amount of material, although we'll see maybe that's not true later on today when we do the Mass Hall presentation. But if we take this activity, we create a logic link between these two. There's a new tick box that says set the quantity from the predecessor. So if I reschedule that, and that's a start to start link that you've noticed. So if I reschedule that, then now you can see the annotation updated to 400 cubic meters. This task is still 5 hours long. It's moved to the original location. So if I select this link again, or maybe I should go back to our narrative, because you can also set a link so that the successor task inherits the duration of the predecessor. So if I select this activity, this link, I can also say that I want it to synchronize the duration. So when I reschedule next, then this activity has got the same duration as this activity. So that's very useful in those circumstances and in some other circumstances. And there's another refinement in that if we've got a finish to finish link, we've got an option that lets that finish to finish link set the end date of the successor taken from the predecessor. So I've got a finish to finish link here that I'm just creating. So if I also say that this can calculate the end date of the successor, so it can only happen with a finish to finish link, and it can also activate some lag. So if I wanted to say, well, I want the successor to finish half an hour after the predecessor, and I reschedule, then it will do that, because the first one's saying calculate the duration, but then it's adding on whatever this finish to finish link might say. So if we want this to start an hour after this one starts, but it can finish half an hour later, then we can drive the durations of these things and keep them in step. So those are very useful features for those who do some scheduling, and you can only do certain scheduling in Tilos that you can't do anywhere else. But also for those who've been into this as well, which because this existed in Tilos 9, you can have pure distance links, and these can now pick up the lead and lag values from a complex shape. So if I show you this example, and this is mainly for, sorry, using the wrong example here. So this is mainly in the short rail arena. So what we've got in the short rail is a possession plan. It's used very commonly in the rail industry for possession planning. So I've got elements that represent activities that represent the components of a train, what's called a train configuration. So I've got a ballast laying machine, and that's driving the process, because that's got a certain quantity of material and a certain rate at which it can be laid, and it's got a certain footprint. So but the configuration of this is that it's got a certain amount of lag before the active line and after it, which represents the sort of physical nature of that machine. And then we've got the locomotive itself that is pulling it, and we've got the wagons that it's dragging behind it. And again, these have all got a length generated from the number of wagons that you've got. So there's some very sophisticated resourcing goes on, and it can determine the size of these things. So the problem has always been, this is the thing that drives it. We want to position this wherever we want it to go, and when we reschedule, we want it to move around. So we can do that now with the links. So I've got a link going out here, and it's synchronizing the duration, but also it's moving the successor in distance. So it's saying, just pick this up and move it. And so we've got the same distance and the same time, and I've got the a pure distance link saying that set the end of it to be the same end distance as the predecessor. And we've got the same thing outgoing. So if we reschedule this, it moves around. If I change this and say, well, we're going to do that later and a different place, and it's going to take me longer to do it, I've only got to do that to one activity, and everything else moves around as an entity. And that's a really great way of behaving, and we can have that set as a task group, and then we can just draw one rectangle, and our complex train can be positioned in exactly the right place and behave correctly. So that's a really big thing for those who do those sorts of things. So that's all the reschedule improvements. There's a few Gantt chart improvements, so we can add a new task by using the insert key. So again, those who use the Gantt chart, so I think you've got to do this with no grouping. So I've got an item, a bar chart item. I select a row on the table, on the spreadsheet, and I add a new, well, I either through adding a new task or through and choosing a task template. So I've got a task template selected, but I can select a row on the bar chart, and I can hit the insert key, which you can't see me do on screen. And so I've added a new task, which is based on the concrete bed, the task template that I've already got selected. So so that's a way of doing that wasn't previously available for those who work in the Gantt charts. You can create a new task by dragging a task template from the library to the Gantt chart. So again, if I had a task template, I've got my concrete bed, I can drag that and drop it on this row here, and there it's selected. So I can create things quite readily on the time distance diagram on the Gantt chart, but of course I've got to give them a distance value, otherwise they won't appear in the time distance diagram. So I'm going to select that and hit the delete key. So there are new ways of interacting. When you zoom out, it didn't used to do this, but when you zoom out, if you zoom out now, it didn't used to create extra space at the end. So now you can do that to create new activities over here, for example, that was harder to do previously. So and you can hide quantity values for summary tasks, which wasn't available before. So if anybody had a desire to do that, I've got a quantity task here. If I edit that column on the extra, there's a tick box that says hide value on summary tasks. So you just get a number. You don't get any units, for example. And so you can hide the summary task rows for ungrouped sub-projects in the Gantt chart, which is a display item. So on the Gantt chart, although it's probably, I don't think I've got this situation set up, one of the options is to turn off the summary bars on the Gantt chart, but you can also color code the task now, which you could already to some extent, but you've got some more control over that. So if I group this Gantt chart, so I've grouped this Gantt chart, so Gantt chart settings, or right mouse click Gantt chart settings. So I can choose to group a Gantt chart, and I can choose what I'm going to group it by. So I've chosen to use the work breakdown structure, but you can use all of these different aspects. And if you're familiar with P6 or Power Project, then you can also go behind each of these rows, and you can choose the color from what you've given it in the library, or you can again choose the color from a color code set that you've made in advance. And so in that way, you can choose to group it in the usual way that's an attractive. So where people are not using, we're using tasks primarily for time distance planning, you can still show the Gantt chart. It's a familiar way of having it. So very popular in possession planning, but perhaps less in the larger projects where you're going to use P6 for that basis. But there it's a useful and reasonable bit of kit. So just to finish off, a few minor items. So a task can have a hyperlink stored against it, or a file. So with a selected task, there's a new tab called File Links. So you can just give it some description. If you want to, you can give it a symbol, and that symbol, for example, will appear on the activity, and it appears in the center. There's nothing you can do about its location. And so that's just so you can see if something's got a comment on it or not. And then if you've got this highlighted, you can click on the magnifying icon down here, and it's going to launch that document. So it's useful for specifications, descriptions, backup calculations in Excel spreadsheets, etc. So that's a useful item. So on the link properties pane, you've got an additional information that makes it easy to understand, perhaps when you're choosing a successor, and you can see the existing predecessors and the existing successors associated with each of the activities, and so you can navigate to where it's better. It's got a bit more information to base that judgment upon. The selection of which sub-project is displayed is used for the display. So maybe a little bit of discussion. So if I go to my this view here, because I've got some summaries in this one, I'll also point out that in the project data, I've got more than one sub-project. So the time distance cell or the Gantt chart on the cell settings, you're choosing through this button here which sub-project you're going to display in this cell. So we can choose only the task from this one or the task from both of these. And so I've got this one set up. So previously, and obviously some people have longer lists here, so HS2 got 5 or 6, so you can select them all easily, you can deselect them all easily, and choose the most appropriate one to see in this particular cell. So that's a slight improvement to what's for those working with many sub-projects. You can set the default duration token, that is what will be displayed for various performance values, and that's in the tools options, and it's this tick box. So I can append the base time unit, and this is the base time unit here, to tokens. So if I've got a duration, so let's take this item and press F8 and get the duration of this item displayed in base time units. So now it says 65, but it's put the D automatically on there because it's picked that up from this request. So if we untick that and we go back again, it just says 65 and not 65D. So for what it's worth. And you can have I think we've covered this one here. This is where you set the color schema for summary outlines on the time distance diagram, and that's under tools options display. So it's this section here is going to govern those different appearances if you're into using those sorts of things. So we want to see the details but not the summary, for example. So and finally, I think for that, then some advanced resource options, mainly in the Mass Hall area. But if we take a resource, and I did this somewhere, but whether I think it was on concrete, but oh, it was asphaltic binder there. I think that was it. Yeah. So so if we take the operational value is how many rubber wheeled rollers we need, and we could just type 2 in there, but we've also got this calculator which allows us to say, well, take the length of the activity, and you get that by pressing the F8 key. So all of these numeric parameters on this activity can then have other enumerators and be divided by the work rate or something, and that can calculate how many of these you need. And of course, as the length would change in the plan or the quantity, then the number of resources required could be driven by that. So that's often about when you're hauling material over a distance, the efficiency of which that can happen can be incorporated in that calculation of the amount of material, for example. So so that's the final point of the presentation. I'm going to stop